Welcome everyone to our CLE today, dealing with vaccinations, obviously, and we have the title of it, which has come from our COVID-19 task force with the college, and it is called Evolving Realities for Working During COVID-19, Issues for Employers, Employees, and Unions in Navigating Vaccine Mandates and Other Return to Work Policies. I can assure you we worked long and hard on that succinct and catchy title. And we are very thrilled to have like an all-star panel with us today, who I will introduce very shortly. Just a couple of housekeeping items that we need to deal with. First, the handout materials, and a CLE form are available for downloading during the program in the handout section of your dashboard. And just to reiterate, you need to do the downloading while we're live. Okay, so if we go off and you haven't downloaded, you will not be able to get them. Okay, if you're on a tablet, this may be found on the menu bar at the top of your screen next to the question mark icon. Click what looks like a piece of paper with the lower left-hand corner turned down. The materials does include a CLE form that must be completed and returned to cle@safehearth.com, and that actual email is on the form, so you don't have to worry about that. And again, the materials needed to be downloaded and the form during the webinar. Okay, a CLE code will be announced during the last 10 minutes of the program. And the handout section, as I said, is where you'll find the CLE form. And all of us want to thank Safe Hearth Shore for sponsoring our CLE credits today. Now, there will be the code, so don't forget to hang around if you want to get credit for the program, which I will announce. What we've decided to do, because it's a very voluminous topic in terms of its changing nature and many different facets of it, we're going to try to go through and save questions for the end. And of course, that's subject to change. We're going to be flexible, but that is our plan, at this point. Okay. And now, before I introduce the panel, I just want to say, in terms of the handouts, we have something that's been prepared from a plaintiff's perspective, issues of someone not wanting to be vaccinated and what questions come up in consultation with our plaintiff's lawyer representative, which I'll get to. And we also have some client alerts from Littler dealing with various aspects of this vaccination, including, of course, the announcement by President Biden of the impending mandate. And finally, we've included the briefs in chief in the injunction proceeding in the Second Circuit, which challenged the ruling upholding the mandate for teachers and educational workers in the New York City schools. The briefs in chief before the circuit were there on the injunction. It's important to know that initially the injunction was granted, and then a couple of days later, a three-judge panel reversed that, and that mandate has actually gone into effect. There is a little bit of a limited use of the information in the briefs because it's a public employee matter, and I know many or most of you deal with private employers, but I think it's interesting for you to see what arguments are raised, and I think we all know that those arguments, which did not hold up in terms of the injunction, are much, much stronger than the very weak arguments that people would have, other than the accommodations in the private sector. Okay, now, so getting to our panel, we are blessed, with having people that are living and breathing this every day. So Devjani Mishra from Littler Mendelsohn is a shareholder there, and she advises management regarding all aspects of the employer-employee relationship. And she's the leader of the Littler COVID-19 practice group and has clients all over the country of all different shapes and sizes, and will have a lot of insight, for us. The details of these bios, by the way, are available, in the handouts. At least that's my understanding. So next we have Yona Rosen, who's the Associate General Counsel of the AFL-CIO, who works in Washington. And Yona has experience first with the NLRB. She's also been a litigator in a small firm in Texas and represented unions and individuals. She is licensed and obviously and certified by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization in Labor and Employment. And since 2014 has been working at the NLRB, I'm sorry, at the AFL-CIO as Associate General Counsel, where she handles a variety of responsibility, including NLRB matters and the Department of Labor and Employment Law issues and related policy and legislative issues. Next, we have Reginald Odom, who is the current Senior Vice President and Chief People Officer for the Hospital of Special Services, Special Surgery, I'm sorry, and is dealing really more or less with all of these COVID issues. He is the #1 COVID guy there at HSS, and he has also worked at NYU, Lango Medical Center, as their labor relations specialist, and has also worked as an associate at Proskauer Rose. So he has extensive management side labor and employment experience, as well as specific experience with COVID-19. And finally, and hardly last but not least, we have Nicholas Woodfield, who is a plaintiff's employment lawyer in Washington, D.C., and has done a lot of work in terms of appellate advocacy, trial work, obviously dealing with all issues, including discovery and whistleblower claims, non-payment of misclassification of wages under the FLSA, and has dealt with a lot of retaliation cases, discrimination cases, qui tam actions, you name it. And Nicholas is the one who prepared the handout dealing with questions brought to him. So everyone knows we're going to use a sort of question and answer format. We're not going to do like traditional presentations that maybe people are used to. So we're just going to go around and deal with many questions that we've developed, together. And hopefully they will deal with a lot of the issues and problems that you may be all out there, all experienced with your own clients. So to set the table, I'm just going to start with sort of a broad question just to get the issues out there, and then we will delve into them to the detail to the extent we can. So just as to, well, I guess, Johnny, we'll start with you. Since President Biden issued the impending vaccine mandate, what concerns have your clients been raising regarding its implementation?
Sure. Thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We know you have your choice of many webinars every day of this. I think the important thing here is that the Biden mandate is really a collection of mandates. And so, clients are coming at this differently depending on how it's going to cover them. There's a piece of this that relates to federal contractors who provide certain services to the government. And so there's many questions for those individuals, because fundamentally the government can decide who it wants to buy services from or not, and impose the requirements that it's going to, impose. There are the healthcare mandates, which I know Reginald could speak to all day, if you participate in Medicare and Medicaid. And then there's the as yet to be released OSHA emergency temporary standard that is meant to cover all employers with 100 employees or more. And so, those three are coming from the federal level. We obviously here in New York and the Northeast and on the West Coast have seen state and local level mandates as well. So which set of mandates a company could be subject to is almost a choose your own adventure phenomenon, where people are asking, will this cover me? Am I the kind of federal contractor who's covered or not? Are there exceptions? How much time do I have? And of course, what do we do with accommodations? And then what do we do with the still very high percentage of employees, and this varies regionally, who may not want to get vaccinated but don't have a protected reason not to get vaccinated? So there are a lot of concerns around, will this cover me? How much time do I have? What do I need to do? And what do I do if a large percentage of my workforce doesn't want to be vaccinated? On the other hand, we definitely have clients who are actually relieved to see federal action, because it puts them in a position where they can say, it's not our decision. We need to be responsive to our customers, in this case, the federal government, which accounts for a lot of business for many of our clients. And so we can point to that and say, this is the reason that we have to do this. Putting politics aside, putting polarization aside, this is the way that we have to go.
Okay. Reg, you want to pick up there from your end in the healthcare setting?
Sure. So I think from a healthcare perspective, it's something we've been thinking about long before President Biden came out with the mandate. Obviously, getting the brunt of the COVID issue in the healthcare world, it's an area that a number of the healthcare organizations have been toying with for a while. We were actually talking about putting in a mandate in my particular organization, my current organization, in May or June, and somewhere around late June, we made a decision that we were probably going to put one in place. But what happened along the way as we were having our internal discussions about how we would roll it out, the governor in New York made a decision that spurred us along and said that all healthcare employers are going to have to mandate vaccinations by September 27th. So we got a little bit ahead of the game in terms of the process, and it leads to a whole host of other issues that I'm sure we're going to get to later on today, because with the governor's mandate, they did not include a religious exemption, which sent everybody a little bit into a tizzy on how we were going to manage it. So we literally just went past our mandate date. And as an organization, I'm happy to give you guys details later on about what we decided to do and how we did it. Ultimately, we did our mandate, and we have about 98% of our population that's vaccinated now. There's been some pushback associated with it, but for the most part, we got it done pretty successfully.
Thank you. Nick, what about you? What type of issues are employees raising with you?
Well, it's kind of interesting because we see only one side of it, really. The people who are happy to be vaccinated or that are enthusiastic about being vaccinated don't call us, because no one calls me. No one in the history of the time that I've been in a plaintiff's employment lawyers ever just called me and said, I just want to check in and tell you everything's good. No, we get people who are concerned about being vaccinated, and they come from a myriad of different angles. And most of them come in and they'll say that my employer either is introducing a mandate, or they're toying with it, or I'm concerned about this. And they'll start off saying, here are the reasons why I shouldn't be vaccinated. And it can be any number of reasons. And I start off, quite frankly, I always tell them, look, I'm going to tell you this because they all start fishing for this information. They say, where does your firm have a policy? And I said, look, I'm vaccinated, but my job is to advise you on what your goals are if you want to try and get to the point from point A to point B. And I explained to them, I think you need to look at this a little differently from the perspective than you are right now. They're all terrified that a mandate is being introduced as a means of culling them from the workforce. They all think that because they may disagree with the way that their employer views with COVID, that this is a way of getting rid of them. And I explained to them, think about it from a different perspective. Your employer's got these pressures on you, but the question is, what if you have an issue with it? We need to identify what the issue is legitimately, and then work to the end to try and get you where you want to be. And if your goal is to not be vaccinated because you're terrified of it, or you have a religious aversion, or you've got a medical aversion, you want to continue working and stay employed, and you want to be productive, and you want your employer to appreciate you, and how do we get you there? And so we talk about it from that perspective in terms of what they can do. And the benefit of it typically is everyone for the last 18 months has been working in a slightly different environment than they historically have. So they know if they can work in an alternative work environment. But the people that come to us because they're typically concerned that if they don't get vaccinated, they're going to lose their job, and they want to know what their options are and what recourse might be available if that happens. But before we get there, we talk about how you can get from point A to B without losing some skin off your body in the first place.
Got it. Okay. And Yona, what about from the perspective of unions? What concerns are being raised there?
I'm sorry. I actually was going to react to something that Nick said, because truthfully, I mean, I think this is where unions come from. It's a safety issue, and I think unions by and large are very supportive of vaccines. I think the question is wanting to be involved in the implementation and wanting to talk about what the impact is going to be, what the options are for people who do have religious or medical issues. But not every. I mean, it's actually, many of us have been working in a different environment, but there are whole swaths of folks who have been working in exactly the same environment that they always work in and have not been at home and not working remotely and have been subject to exposures, people in the meatpacking plants, people in the grocery stores, people in the hospitals. So I do think it's an issue that unions by and large are supportive. They want to have education process to help folks get to the point where they will be vaccinated. But I do think also that it is a health and safety issue. And I think where there's some differences, there's having to be some sort of balancing, because frankly, there are people who are amongst the memberships of various unions who are the people who are probably calling Nick. So I think, you have to sort of balance where your membership is, but also kind of what is the position that you're going to take. And I think the main thing that I'm aware of unions are concerned about is being involved, which, we'll talk about probably later, in the decision and how it's being implemented in terms of what the process is going to be, what the requirements are, what is the discipline going to be, or what steps are going to be taken if somebody doesn't comply with the requirements. So that's sort of what I would say in response, as from the perspective of what are unions concerned about. As an employer, and I actually do some management work myself internally at the Federation, we have been back at work since July 7th and have a mandatory vaccination policy. So we've been dealing with this.
Interesting. So let me ask you, Deb, Johnny, we'll start with the issue of testing versus vaccinating. It seems like the mandate does permit for weekly testing in lieu of vaccination. Is that the way you understand it? And how are you advising your clients with respect to that?
Sure. So again, this is going to vary depending on which part of the mandate. There are portions of the federal contractor mandate that are not going to allow for testing for individuals who would otherwise be working in certain settings. There are, our expectation, and again, we're guessing, I'll be the first to say we're reading tea leaves on the OSHA mandate, but it seems like what we can expect is that there will be a requirement for employers to test unless people are vaccinated, and that might get them out of testing. It would be quite a big move for OSHA to attempt to require employers to vaccinate their employees. That would run into a lot of ground we haven't really covered before. But I think we could see a situation where it would say you will have to test unless you're vaccinated, and that will be the way that you get out of it. The tricky part here is that, as best as we can understand it, whether you look at the FLSA, whether you look at precedents under reasonable accommodation, mandatory medical testing rules, or reimbursement for expenses, most roads lead to the employer having to pay the costs of tests, which can be quite substantial. Most roads probably also, and this is where I say, Nick, shut your ears. Most roads probably also lead to an argument in many states that non-exempt employees get paid for time if they have to undergo mandatory medical tests as a condition of working. And that can cause the cost of a testing program to mount up very quickly. I think what a lot of companies are looking at is a situation where they may provide testing as an option to people who cannot be vaccinated, but they are not eager to provide it broadly to hundreds or even thousands of employees, depending on their size, week after week. We are seeing, serious issues around enough tests being available. There's some news on that today. But if you think about it, if you have to test 100 employees every week at $150 a test and also pay for time, somewhat indefinitely, because I cannot tell you, and I've been looking at this as much as anyone, I cannot tell you when this is going to be over. So if you're looking at mounting a program like that, plus the administrative burden of making sure everybody actually does it, plus the administrative burden of dealing with scheduling and backup scheduling when people are not able to work, it gets very complicated and it gets very burdensome for the employer, to have such a program, except where they really need to, except where you have someone who legitimately has a medical contraindication or sincerely has a religious objection to testing. So I think, there was quite a bit of interest when this was first starting to be floated at the end of July, when the very first version of the federal contractor mandate was announced. But I think as employers realized, how many different ways they might have to pay for testing, they got a lot less interested in it quickly.
Right.
There is, some desire, if you think that you can get employees to pay for it, that maybe it would, so to speak, annoy them into finally getting vaccinated if they had to shell out for it, but it's never quite that easy.
Right.
All right, Nick, you can go back to listening now.
Reg, in your experience so far in the hospital setting, obviously, how is the vaccine versus testing, dichotomy playing itself out?
So it's interesting, being a hospital, you have the facilities and the capability to do testing on a regular basis without a lot of significant effort. It's a matter of just setting it up. But much like Devjani said, when you start looking at the numbers associated with testing people on a regular basis, there's really no appetite from a business perspective to have that ongoing cost. We've all been talking about COVID's going to be ending soon. It's going to be ending soon. And here we still are, and with no real end in sight. So, we took a hard position that it was going to be everybody has to get vaccinated. We thought about the option of doing PCR testing. And what we ended up was the only people who would do weekly testing were the people who we gave a medical exemption, or in our case, we didn't technically give religious exemptions because the state mandate that came out in New York didn't provide for religious exemptions, but we put them in kind of a holding category right now because that's still being litigated in the courts. And we hope some decision will come sometime in the middle of this month that gives us some clarity on how we deal with religious exemptions as well. So we have them in a holding category, and the medical and the religious exemptions, so to speak, are all doing weekly testing is what we have happening right now.
Gotcha. Now, Nick, from people coming in your office, has there been much discussion of, I'd rather be tested than vaccinated, or how has that come up?
It actually doesn't a lot. And I think it's because anyone who's ever been PCR tested realizes it's not something you want to do every week. It is an unpleasant experience, and it can be more unpleasant depending on who does it. But people are more interested in just simply saying their initial thoughts are actually kind of uninformed, and I don't blame them for it because it's not something you would have knowledge of. They think if they can invoke a religious exemption or an ADA accommodation and say, I'd just like to be accommodated and not have to do this, that they can just then walk into the office without a mask and resume life like it was back in 2015, and everything would go back to normal. And you explain to them that if you get the religious exemption and if you get the ADA accommodation, I don't actually think those are going to be the obstacles that everyone thinks they are. I feel like the guy at the football game, when everyone's cheering, that's over in the end zone holding up a sign saying the end is near, because I'm saying an entirely different message than everyone else in the game. I don't think the employers are that eager to shoot people down on the religious exemption. I don't think they're that eager to shoot them down on the ADA accommodation, because that's only the first half of the issue. The next issue is, if you're accommodated, if you're exempted, can you still return to work safely? And so if you can't, the question is then, what can they do in the alternative to remain employed? And I explained to them, it's going to be a very awkward employment discussion with your employer when they say, what's your religion? And you say XYZ, and they go, when was the last time you went to church? You're not going to get those. That's, if I was advising employers, I would say stay away from that. It's a very low bar, but you're not going to get anywhere. Likewise, the people who are saying I've got asthma, or I've got a heart condition, et cetera, that are expressing fear, I think, you know, I don't think the employers are looking to try and negate that reason. I think the employers are trying to look for a way to make it work.
Well, we're going to explore those exemptions ad nauseum a little down the road, but I appreciate what you're saying, though, about, you know, there are concerns about testing versus not, you know, being vaccinated and not coming up very often. Yona, what about from the union side? Is there any you know, preference, you know, as to how to deal with this issue in terms of testing versus vaccinating?
Well, again, I'm more responding based on my employer's hat, but we have a mandate, and there is no option for testing. I think that really, from a safety, if your concern is safety, I mean, the problem is testing once a week doesn't necessarily protect somebody. You know, I saw a plan where somebody was going to do testing once a month. Well, that's really not going to do anything in terms of protecting the safety of the folks who are working next to you, if in fact these people are being brought in to work next, because all the testing is, it shows that at that point in time, you are not, you know, you don't test positive, but that's not to say that 2 days later you don't test, you wouldn't have tested positive if you went back and had another test. So I think, you know, as I said, I think the unions that I'm aware of are taking one of two stances. Either they are agreeing to mandatory vaccines, you know, with obviously the exemptions that are, you know, required by law, and encouraging, trying to build the education process to encourage people to be vaccinated, or are perhaps, again, either just maybe not agreeing to mandatory vaccines, but trying to encourage voluntary vaccination. Because if you're going to have people working side by side, that's the safest way.
Bill, if you don't mind me jumping in, I just want to share, you know, what happened to me today. So we're a little past a week into our vaccination mandate, and what I got was a wave of pushback from all the people who are vaccinated saying, we don't like the idea that you have these people working next to us who are not vaccinated. I don't care that they have to take a test. Just as Yona was saying, you know, at the time they take a test, they may be negative, but who knows what happens 2 or 3 days later. So that was what I was dealing with first thing this morning, a wave of disgruntled individuals who are upset that we haven't required everybody to take a test or stay outside of the facility.
Got it. You know, I was going to deal with that a little later, but I think it has found its way into our into our discussion. So, Debjani, how do you handle and how are you advising clients who have workers who have issues working alongside someone who isn't vaccinated and they are, or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the frustrating aspects of this, right? We have the EEOC guidelines that came out in December. And at the time that they came out, they basically said, you know, excluding people from the workplace who are unvaccinated should be the last resort. You know, but if you think about what was going on at that time, we'd already had an entire year of, you know, those who could work remotely, working remotely, those who are on the front line and essential working in person with PPE. And so the EEOC was never going to say it's not safe for people to work with PPE because that's how people had been working. But I think what the EEOC didn't anticipate is that, you know, I think they thought, we're going to have a vaccine, people are going to take the vaccine, and once you take it, you're pretty much safe. Where we've ended up is we have a vaccine, a lot of people haven't taken it, and the people who have taken it are still at risk of breakthrough infections from the people who haven't, and, you know, from each other. And so, you know, we've ended up kind of in a place where a lot of employers, rightly or wrongly, have arrived at a position of you can come back to the office if you're vaccinated, or you can travel if you're vaccinated, or you can meet in person with people if you're vaccinated. But fundamentally, if you're not vaccinated, you know, you're more likely, where the work allows, to find yourself working remotely indefinitely, or in some workplaces being put on unpaid leave. And there is this very real schism in some workplaces as between who is and who isn't. You know, the EEOC kind of talks a good game, doesn't give us a lot of practical guidance on this issue of vaccination status being confidential, you know, but given that it is something that in many cases you're wearing on your face whether you're vaccinated or not. It's hard to say, people aren't vaccinated. If you are in New York City and you're taking people to lunch, you either will or won't be able to go into a restaurant because you will or won't be able to show proof of vaccination. So it's this weird kind of confidential information that doesn't stay confidential for long. And people have very strong feelings about it. 700,000 Americans have died at this point. Almost everyone has been touched by this in some way or other. And, at the point where the CDC gave us this guidance in May that said, you can follow these protocols if you are, and these if you're not, the joke within Littler is like, we're turning our workplaces into the Sharks and the Jets, but, with less music and less fun. You have different camps, and people feel very, very strongly about it, and people justifiably feel strongly about it. Every person with a child under 12 technically has a vulnerable individual at home.
Right.
So this is real. It may not be a legal issue, but it's definitely an employer relations issue in a big way.
From that standpoint, I mean, are you aware of any efforts to actually separate people or have them wear buttons? Or, I mean, it gets kind of absurd, but I'm sure it's a real concern in actual workplace.
Yeah, no, I don't think I've gotten this many questions about stickers since I was in 7th grade. There's a lot of, can we have a badge? Can we have a sticker? Right, wristbands, headbands, can we put stickers on hats? I mean, you wouldn't believe the places you could put stickers. But that is the question, if you're going to have different safety rules, how do you operationally manage that? And there is no good answer. Some companies have campuses where they could have one building for this, one building for that. Again, from a public health standpoint, does it make sense to concentrate all your unvaccinated people together? Probably not. So this is very hard, and it's very specific to every employer. What do you do? How do you work? Where do you work? Is it even possible to get 6 feet of separation between people? And is that enough, given something like Delta that is more contagious, more easily transmitted? So
if I might jump in here, just give you the converse of that, I cannot tell you the number of people who said, my employer has talked about having people being, having to wear stickers or having to work in special places, or they say, I'm not allowed into this restaurant that I like to go to. And they say, isn't that discrimination? And I have to launch back into the, before 1964, you could fire people because of the color of their skin. You could fire people because they wouldn't have sex with you. Whether it's right or wrong, there's no law saying that you cannot tell people that refuse to be vaccinated that they can't come in, or that they're not allowed to come into your restaurant. There's not a law saying you cannot tell people that refuse to be vaccinated that they can only eat outside because you're concerned about the safety. Right now, there's no law that exists. So while it may be discrimination, it's not illegal discrimination. I have to explain that to people, that until there's a law protecting that, you've got to deal with that. So you've got to think, again, what do you want to do here and what are your goals? Because my job is to try and get them from their A to B, and their A to B may not be feasible. And if it's not feasible, I have to tell them. But it's interesting because people presume they have rights, and they presume my body's inviolate, and it is to a degree. But your body, your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. It's that kind of thing. And there's the decision, the Jacobson decision, in my handout, that basically says your right to not be vaccinated ends when it starts impinging on everyone else's rights to be healthy and safe. And so that balancing act doesn't allow you to say, I demand to be allowed into Wendy's without a mask.
Thank you. Now, Yona, what about, I know unions try to treat all of their, workers, rank and file the same. Have you heard of this issue bubbling up where I don't want to work with that woman or that guy because they're not vaccinated and I am, or what have you?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a concern, and it goes back to, the health and safety is what the unions are frequently trying to negotiate in terms of these policies. And I think, there are things, well, for example, in terms of the differentiation between people who are vaccinated and not vaccinated, I mean, in our return to work protocols, we are all wearing masks unless we're in our office. We are all distanced, you know, even in meetings. I mean, there's safety, and in terms of talking with our health and safety folks, there's sort of this Swiss cheese idea that you put in these protocols that, you know, it's not fail safe all by this one protocol because it does have the holes, but you put the next protocol in, again, it's not totally safe. But when you layer the protocols one on the other together, and you have, you know, for example, we have in our protocols, we have to take a health assessment every morning before we come to work. Our temperatures are taken. If somebody has had any kind of exposure, you know, we're encouraging and basically advising people to take. It's not going to count against their leave totals, so that you do, if people are sick, if people do have symptoms, if people have been exposed, you're keeping them out of the workplace. And if you have multiple layers, and then you have tracing. So we have had some cases, but we've had absolutely no spread in those cases, which I think is indicative of having these multiple layers of safety that then do enable you to have a safe workplace.
Now, Reg, you were confronted with this today. You chimed in before. So what is your response to this? How can this be addressed in a hospital setting?
Well, I think it's really just kind of re-educating people about the process and stepping back for a minute and reminding people that 98% of our population got vaccinated. Let's start there. And then let's take a look and remind them that there's a small percentage of people who have very legitimate medical reasons why they can't be vaccinated. And, you know, remember the overarching rules for the organization is that everybody is masked unless, you know, they're in the privacy of their office, or if they're eating lunch and they still need to, you know, make sure that they provide the appropriate spacing. So, you know, we have standard rules that cut across the board, and that's what has to apply. There was also some frustration about the people who, you know, potentially have religious exemptions out there. The same logic. They're wearing masks. They're being tested. We're taking the same precautions that we would for everybody else. We also talk to people about travel, and if you've traveled, you know, we have the benefit, you know, that a lot of employers don't have. We have an occupational health and safety service on site. We encourage people, hey, if you have to go travel, on the way back in, come in and do a test. You know, that's for vaccinated or not vaccinated people. We recognize that vaccinated folks can, you know, potentially get the Delta variant and potentially pass the disease along as well. So we encourage people to utilize the services of being a hospital and get tested frequently. So we still encourage that and just try to keep people calm and let them know that there's layers of protection. I think that's what Yona was saying. There's layers of protection you put in place, and you do the best you can to prevent anybody from getting ill.
Thank you. Now, Debjani, in terms of your broad experience and the different sizes of your clients, what about for the less than 100, you know, employee type clients? Are you counseling them any different? Because the mandate isn't really going to stick on them, but I would think the issues might be the same to some degree. So can you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, it's been interesting because on the one hand, you would think, well, they're going to be safe because they're not going to be hit by anything. On the other hand, a lot of these are startup, more scientifically minded, more technically minded clients. Many of them went to vaccine mandates on their own. You know, we joke about the folks who all ate ramen together as they were starting up the company. There is, you know, some connectedness there and some ability, especially where the founders are still part of the organization, for people to have conversations with each other and, you know, kind of a shared mutual belief in keeping each other safe and being able to explain, you know, we're in this together. So some of them were quicker to embrace mandates than anyone else. Some of them right now are worried about, you know, we don't want to be the repository for everyone who gets let go from a bigger organization for not being vaccinated. That wouldn't be helpful to us. And some of them, quite frankly, are being driven by who their customers are. You know, there is this piece of this that independent of any governmental mandate is, you know, well, we provide services to this other bigger company and they've imposed a mandate. So we need to do what they're doing or we won't have business. But yeah, it is a little bit different. You know, they may be less likely to have some of the structures in place as far as providing time off to people to get the vaccine, you know, or deal with side effects. They may not have had a lot of formal policies, and so they had to develop everything they had over the past year and a half to deal with COVID. But, you know, it can go really either way. I think it's also very regional in terms of, you know, what smaller employees might be doing, again, in the Northeast, the West Coast versus, you know, parts of the country where we see much lower vaccination rates. But, you know, they may be safe from whatever it is that OSHA is about to do whenever they're about to do it, but they've probably been buffeted, you know, by market forces some other way by now.
Right. Now, Reg, I know I'm guessing that HSS has more than 100 employees. However, you have vast experience in different settings. Any thoughts on how to counsel employers with less than 100 employees?
Well, I think Debjani touched on a lot of the important points. I think it's really about just the thinking about the health and safety of your staff. I guess, you know, at other organizations, I've been in my current organization for about 6 months now. At the prior organization, while we were relatively large as well, there was a slightly different approach. We were supporting the New York City health and hospital system. So we tended to follow their mandates and how they would manage issues like that. And they were a little bit slower, a little bit more thoughtful, a little more methodical about their approach to dealing with some of those issues, a lot more involvement with the union and discussions about how we wanted to lay things out and set up the rules. But the fundamental goal is always the same thing. It's what's in the best interest of individuals from a health and safety perspective. And I've seen it evolve. You start off with, you know, who are we allowing back in the office? You know, is it only the vaccinated people when they come in the office? Do they have to wear the mask? Do they take off the mask? Remember, we were talking about taking off masks for a while until we heard of this thing called the Delta variant. Then the mask quickly went back on, and I don't know when they're going to come back off. So I think it's really about just trying to work within the organization and see what the level of comfort is. And each organization, whether they're large or small, needs to do what they think is the right thing for them to operate. Now, the piece that I'll throw in, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, is if you're going to talk about testing, the smaller organization, that's going to be a crippling factor for them. The cost of managing testing for them is usually a problem. So they're going to make a decision to mandate usually or not mandate at all. That's what I've found.
Now, Nick, what about you? Has this come up in, have people identified themselves with smaller employers and feel differently about whether they can be forced to be vaccinated or not?
Yeah, and we hear that, and it's interesting because I can empathize with them because I talk to them because we get people in small and enterprises who say, you know, does this apply to me? And also the people, I've had people say, I've got this firm, we only have 8 people. Do I have to do this? And what do we do? And I explain to them, in our firm that has 50 people in total, we are kicking the can down the road as long as we can. What we do is we tell people, if you want to come in, you have to provide proof of vaccination, but as long, you know, you've managed to work remotely for a year and a half, we can do that for as long as this can continue to work, and you don't have to tell us your vaccination status and you don't have to do anything. And then we don't have to confront the issue unless and until we have to. And I think that is the way a lot of employers are doing it, because if you're a smaller entity, why do you need to force not only the expenses, but the confrontation with your employees? If someone's been working there 10 years and they're a good employee, but they're ideologically unaligned with where the rest of the organization is, you don't need to lose that employee over this issue if you can just kick the can down the road. Likewise, with the employees, we tell them, you know, look, if you've been working remotely and they've got this idea and you just tell them, I'm terrified of this, why don't you just ask, can we keep this going for a while and not make the decision tomorrow? Can we make it in a month if there's no requirement that we have to do this? And most people generally can do that because no one wants to lose half their workforce or a third of their workforce or whatever arbitrarily. So I think there's a lot of people who are dealing with it by maintaining the status quo of working remotely until things change, hopefully.
Right. Nona, what about in the union world with regard to the smaller employer versus the larger employer? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think I think our issues, and I've been hearing that my sound is bad. I've switched audio. Is this any better?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. Thank you, everyone, all my friends who emailed me. All right, I don't think I really have something to add because I at least in my, I think clearly some of the unions that have come out that have the really large workforces in large employers, maybe this has been, but I can't really make a distinction in terms of, I think a lot of unions have the same approach, whether you're talking about a small employer or a large employer. The things that we, that I had indicated previously, although maybe people couldn't hear with my muffled voice, are the same concerns that they would have in a small employer. And that is the safety issues and wanting to be, wanting to have some say and some to negotiate the effects and the way in which these vaccines are being mandated.
I'm just going to digress for a moment, and Yona, I'll put you semi on the spot since you're our real union person, and maybe Reg can chime in from the management side. But just in general, how has this whole COVID, we'll call it business for lack of a better term, impacted negotiations and collective bargaining in general? Is it a subject of mandatory bargaining? Can you comment on that?
Well, I do think there is, if we're talking about vaccines, I think that's clearly a subject for bargaining. Whether, I think there is some dispute maybe amongst various people as to whether it's mandatory bargaining with respect to the decision to mandate the vaccines or just in terms of the effects, the impact bargaining. But clearly it is it clearly is a subject about which there should be bargaining. And I think that there are a lot of places where, as I said, there can be a partnership through bargaining in terms of an education process. I think a lot of unions have approached it this way in terms of sort of bringing the employees along and educating them for the necessity of having. And I do think the health and safety concerns, as I indicated, there are a lot of ways in which you can come up with systems that are multiple levels of protection for the health and safety issues in terms of exposure, and are very important. Obviously getting the appropriate safety equipment, and I had referenced earlier the meatpacking plants. I think the medical hospitals and nursing homes, and just having people have appropriate PPE, having multiple levels of protection. So.
Right. Have you been finding generally employers are reaching out to unions before they're implementing any policies or procedures?
Yeah, I'm not in my setting, I'm not as much on the ground on that, but I do think that there has been a recognition, although, sometimes I think there is an issue there in terms of, but at least, we sort of monitor all of those of you who are management lawyers. We monitor all your postings and your, I have seen sort of, I would say the various law firms across the board seem to be saying, if you have collective bargaining relationships, this is something that you need to, that they've in the same pieces where they indicated, employers have probably can have a mandatory vaccine policy. If you have a collective bargaining relationship, you need those. That's a topic that you need to bargain about before you implement. So I think pretty consistently.
Just as a humorous aside, what did anybody do when Facebook went down for a couple hours, with monitoring postings? But at any rate, now, Reg, you have a lot of other side collective bargaining experience. Any comments that you have in regard to this COVID issue and bargaining?
Yeah, I think as Jonas said, I think the right approach to this is partnering together. I think it's one of those rare moments from a management side where you get to swing the health and safety banner around. Typically, it's the other side of the fence, and so I could enjoy, say, walking into a conversation with our union representatives and saying health and safety, we got to have these vaccines. So beside enjoying that moment when I get to say that, it really should be a partnership. It's about educating people. And I think that's where the focus was at, before joining Hospital for Special Surgery, I was in a completely unionized environment. And one of the things we were talking about in the very beginning was all the issues associated with getting PPE. So we needed to work with the unions to deal with all of those issues that came up in the early wave of COVID. And then afterwards, while, we could argue about whether, the decision to mandate is something we need to negotiate over, or if there's the effects. But, I think it's pretty clear the mandate is possible. You have to talk to employees about how you're going to work through the process and how you're going to deal with it, and what are you going to do when people refuse to get vaccinated. The goal of this is not to lose employees. The goal, again, like I said, you get that moment to have as safe an environment as possible for your employees. So the best way to do that is simply just working together and bringing people along. I think, some people are just not educated, so you need to educate them. Some people are afraid, and I understand that as well. I mean, think about it. There was a lot of misinformation about COVID from the very beginning, and we're still learning. We're still in a learning process. So it continues to evolve. So the best approach is really partnering with the union to work through the issues and come to a resolution. I think Nick said it earlier. We're not looking to create fights in these issues. We want the people there. We want them working. And if there's a way to make it work, typically employers are okay with doing that.
Right. It's interesting that this is one of those times that union management can work together on the same side, which is, I guess, a good thing. Now,
Bill, one other thing I was just going to add about your question about, it's going to be interesting, I think, as we come out of this, because I do think that there have been, in terms of in collective bargaining and labor management relationships, there's been, arbitrating cases through virtually, negotiating virtually. It's going to be interesting to see how much of that goes beyond the COVID pandemic. And, because in some situations, and not all it's ideal, but in some situations that it's proved to be very helpful in terms of, cases where they're arbitrating case, maybe a simple case, it's more effective, cost-effective way of doing it. Same thing with in some types of collective bargaining. So it'll be interesting to see how much of this carries beyond the COVID pandemic.
we hope that it will carry, and cooperation and working together is always a good thing. So let me just turn to, before we actually delve into the accommodations that the unvaccinated want to rely on, for people who are already working at home. Okay, in other words, they have not been asked to come back. They are working at home. And maybe we'll start with Nick on this one. Have you seen people who are still being requested to be vaccinated even though they're working from home and maybe have an issue with that?
Yeah, I had that literally within the last week. A guy who called me, and I've dealt with him for several years because a couple of years ago he had pretty advanced cancer and then had treatment for it, and he's in remission, but now he's dealing with the sequelae of that cancer treatment. And he's been working remotely for 18 months, and he's working for a government contractor, and he's terrified of having to submit his ADA accommodation because he's thinking he's going to get fired. And I was talking to him saying, look, you of anyone is going to get this ADA accommodation. You are going to get this. The question then becomes, because the real issue is going to be for you, whether you can return to work safely. And what you got to do is you got to talk to your employer about the accommodation that's going to work for both you and them. And you got to start pointing out the fact that for the last 18 months, you've worked remotely and it's worked really well, because you got to align their interests with yours and make sure everyone's syncing up on this, that it can work and it can work well for everyone. Because when we have only so much leverage, you got to use the leverage outside of the four corners of the law to help you. And what that is you got to convince the employer that it's in their best interest as well to keep you working remotely, so that if you can't return back to the workplace and you're going to be unvaccinated in the workplace, subject to testing and wearing an N95 mask, it's still probably not safe for you to be back there. They know that and you know that. And so how do you align interests so that you get to work remotely? And that's where I talked to them about using the last 10 years of your employment there, using the X number of years that you've been there to talk about what you can do remotely and how you can add value. Because like Reg was saying, like Yona was saying, you got to try and figure out what works for everyone. And that's our leverage when I've got someone who's got a very legitimate exemption or an accommodation issue, because you got to make sure it still works for the employer. Because if you're a frontline person, if you're if you're in a hotel and you are working right at the desk, you're potentially a vector, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not. But the risk associated with you and the risk of you getting sick is higher if you're at work. So you got to think of what you can do to add value in another position if you can't be in that position. So we definitely deal with people that are coming in wanting accommodations, and I tell them, a lot of people, I think you're going to get them, because when someone comes in and says they have asthma, and they're concerned, and their doctor, most doctors will support them in these things because the doctors don't want to have that confrontation.
One more thing before we really delve into that, Johnny, how are you counseling employers who have people working from home because they want them working from home? Are they requiring people to still be vaccinated?
There are a lot of folks who ask about it, and as Nick mentioned, if you are working on a covered contract, you are covered even if you are working remotely. So if your employer has the ability to do this, maybe you could be transferred to some other work, but it is possible that the employer doesn't have the flexibility to excuse you unless there's an accommodation in play. I think a lot of employers, in principle, would like to have as close to a uniform policy as they can. And I think the catch here, because we talk about kicking the can down the road, is sort of until when. If effectively someone is going to be working remotely, meaning they can never come in, they can never be convened for the retreat, the picnic, the holiday party, they are never involved in meeting candidates on site. Employers are already here after 18, 19 months of this, have some real concerns about, like, what is this population of people that's just sort of out there that we never can bring in at all for any purpose. So, it's not just remote, we're basically building a wall around your house and you never leave it, as far as we're concerned. And that may not be the best outcome. And it may not be the best outcome for all employees. Some employees really do struggle with being able to work as effectively remotely, cut off from everybody, not able to participate in training classes and so on. And some employers are really worried about, what is the upshot of just having this group that's only ever on video, if in the workplace at all.
Right. Reg, does this affect, I don't know how this would affect you. You have a lot of people that must report to work, obviously, but any thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually, this is a hot topic for us. I mean, and we took the firm position that, our mandate applied to everybody. And we took that position because our view was that at some point in time, you're going to have to come to the office for training, for an event, for some kind of engagement, meetings, et cetera. So we wanted to apply it across the board. Now, there's probably a handful of exceptions because there's maybe individuals who have special skills who we hired with the intent that they were going to work remotely. There's a guy I can think of who works for us in Ohio and does a great job on digital items for us. And, but he comes into the office every couple of months. So because of that, he's got to get tested. If we had a situation where that individual never had to come in, then he would have to be exempt from this rule. So, we have taken the firm position that everybody has to get vaccinated because everybody's got to come in at some point. We're very worried, I think, as Johnny talked about, of the impact this has. And this takes us to a whole nother CLE of our conversation about the culture. How do you impact the culture of an organization when people never show up? I had a conversation with a relatively new hire recently who was telling me she was struggling because she was brand new and was working 100% remote. She didn't know who to call for anything, and she didn't have a buddy who she could ask all the simple little questions, instead of going to her supervisor. So for an employer, it's a real concern. We're really sensitive to that issue, and that's why we took the position we did.
See, Reg, I would love that case. I would love that case where I had someone who had a medical exemption or a religious medical accommodation or religious exemption, and the employer said, we'd like to promote the culture, so you got to get it. If you're going to come in, you got to get it, and we can't accommodate you because of that. Because then I'd say that's where testing applies. That's where the N95 masking and distancing applies. That's a reasonable accommodation in that outlier sense. And I think that's where it's going to work. I think testing is going to be one of those things that dissipates over time as people realize it's kind of like video surveillance. What testing ultimately will show is who infected who over time. That's what testing will do. It's not going to eliminate it in the workplace. So I think what you're going to end up with is you're going to end up with a vaccinated populace, and then you're going to end up with people that have some alternate work arrangement, either through an accommodation, an exemption, or a voluntary agreement, because it works for both parties. And I think that's how it's going to end up.
So I
don't
think
people out there like you know, we always have some one-offs that we take care of just like that, because we recognize there's some sensitivities that we have. There's a particular individual who gave me a phone call when we pushed that policy out for those very same reasons. The person had been working offsite for about 18 months. The job was one where it could be done offsite. We made an exception. So we're watching out for you, so you don't have those cases. I want to keep you unemployed as much as possible.
Yeah, I don't think Reg is gonna let you or any of his peers are gonna put you in a position where there's gonna be an accommodation denied on the grounds of culture. I think the case I'm thinking about, because I do believe this will end at some point, is a couple of years down the line when you have these folks who say, well, I was denied opportunities and I didn't get to promote and I didn't get to advance because I was sitting out in Denver working remotely or wherever I was and everybody forgot about me. They're like, well, yeah, your peers were in headquarters and showing up at the meetings and people thought about them and they thought about you less. And that's going to be really hard to untangle a few years down the line. We're all living in the right now.
That's where it's going
to go. Speak for a moment on this issue of vaccinating those working at home. Has that come up at all?
We've had it come up just because of people who were, say, for example, off on long-term disability and were out sick. We've basically mandated the vaccine when you are at the point where you're, to be in advance so that you are fully vaccinated before you have to come back to the building. So, and I think the other case was before there was the CDC guidance about pregnant women being able to be vaccinated. I know that there were, I would think that would be another place that maybe people would have considered, while you're out on maternity leave, is there really a necessary that you be vaccinated if you had some concerns about being vaccinated while you were pregnant?
Okay. Let's explore the accommodation issue head on. So, Debjani, how are you in terms of, obviously, we all know there are two exemptions. One is disability related, the other is religious. So maybe we could tackle them together in the interest of time. How are you counseling your clients to, address these requests?
Yeah, so I'm gonna take the medical part first because I think it's a little bit simpler, right? There's a small handful of actual medical contraindications, and I think employers are well advised to ask for an actual healthcare provider certifying that this person cannot get the vaccine, whether it's temporary or permanent. Temporary might be the person had COVID too recently, or maybe they're undergoing some kind of treatment or, currently not able to get the vaccine, but they'll be able to later. Permanent might be allergy. It might be some sort of immune situation. It might be, being a cancer survivor can affect vaccine uptake. But we want to distinguish between a healthcare provider has actually told me I can't get the vaccine and I read something on my cousin's friend's Facebook page and now I think I'm a doctor. Like, these are not the same thing. So the fact that somebody says I have concerns is not the same as I can't get it. On the religious side, we are laboring under the last round of EEOC guidelines, which really honestly don't do employers any favors. We have a lot of employers who look at this stuff and they almost want to get into pre-litigation litigation, talking to employees about the whys and wherefores of their beliefs, asking for clergy letters. The reality of the situation is, you could articulate a religious belief that is an objection to the vaccine, even if you don't have the support of clergy, even if you're contrary to your denomination or your organized religion that you profess to belong to. There's a lot of leeway. And I think, to agree with something Nick said earlier, most of what you're seeing is employers not necessarily challenging the sincerity of the objection, but rather pivoting to, can this job be done safely based on what we know now and based on the way that you work and other people work? Is there an accommodation that we can make for this? Now, what I expect to see, which is different from what we've seen before, is that employers are going to look at this in the aggregate and say the aggregate cost of providing accommodation to all of these people is perhaps an undue burden, because we are seeing religious accommodation requests come in many multiples of probably what anyone expected, certainly many multiples of the medical side. We have employers getting dozens, hundreds, thousands of religious accommodation requests. And there is a real question about how you could accommodate that high a percentage of your workforce being unvaccinated and have them working safely. And, again, we all have had the luxury of working remotely. We are not most people. If you have to staff a grocery store, a retail store, a hotel, any place that people have to work frontline, if you're reg, you can't have hundreds and hundreds of people who are not vaccinated and be able to accommodate them and not have some concerns about safety. So this is taking an enormous amount of time. Someone is going to have to be the test case to flesh out what these guidelines mean. Nobody is excited to be it. But we're going to start to see these cases now because, healthcare sort of had the leading edge in terms of implementing their mandates. So we're seeing their mandates come up through court now. And, over the next few months, as more mandates come due, you're going to see more challenges from groups of people who believe, it was or wasn't fair what was done to them.
Are you hearing that these issues may be tackled some in this OSHA, emergency temporary standards, or they're just relying on the EEOC, what have you?
Yeah, I don't see that OSHA is going to break new ground on this. Generally, what we've seen from the federal mandate side is, I think that it's kind of nice. I think they believe the best of everyone, and that objections are only going to be raised in good faith, if you'll pardon the expression. I don't think they're anticipating or thinking about what private employers have been seeing for the last 3 to 4 months. I think they are properly trying to carve out the right amount of space for sincerely held objections. I don't think they've considered the fact there are literally internet websites generating letters that you can buy for $40, even if you've never met the person who writes them, and that they're being submitted as forms.
You are going exactly where I think employers are going to go, and this is why I tell people, I think the employers are going to be smart, and they're going to say, you know what, we're going to give you the religious exemption, we're going to give you the accommodation, but then we're going to look at whether you can do your job safely. And I think the threshold issue is then going to be, we're going to give you that right, but then we're going to pivot and we're going to see where it's going to be. And that's when I tell them it gets a lot squishier, because then you're getting into judgment calls, and courts are going to be reluctant to get into judgment calls. And I think that's the safe haven for employers. And so when I talk to clients, when they're coming in, I'm saying, try and align interests here. Try and come up with an idea of what works with everyone at the beginning, so you don't have to come to that push to shove argument, because your job at the outset is to convince them of the value of you being a good employee. When this all came up, it wasn't to get rid of you. It wasn't to cull the workforce. They've now got this issue. You've now got to figure out how you can continue to give value and tell them why and sell them on that idea of value. Because at the end of things, I don't think this is going to be a big ADA accommodation issue. I don't think it's going to be a religious exemption issue. I think it's going to be who can return to the workplace safely. And that's where I think a court is we're probably going to see a doctrine that gives some deference to employers about safety in the workplace. I mean, it goes back to the Jacobson decision in the Supreme Court. And I think that that's where we need to, as a plaintiff's employment lawyer who I'm representing employees, I tell them you need to be smart from the outset and work with your leverage. And your leverage is your good experience with the employer and adding value. Don't let it get to that stage where you're squaring up.
Reg, thoughts about the accommodations?
Sure. So I can tell you how we approached it. I mean, we went in looking at it from the perspective of there's the medical accommodation, and we actually subdivided a little piece of that, because as Devjani said, what we were looking for was some clear certification from a medical provider that an individual had a contraindication to the vaccine. I was surprised at the number of people put in, attempted medical exemptions that just basically talked about they didn't want to take it, or, I even saw a couple of doctor's notes that said, I'm not advising the person to or not to take it. Well, that doesn't help us. That's not a justification for you not to get it. So we didn't have that many actual medical exemptions that we granted. There were a handful of very legitimate concerns. We saw this other subset, and we kind of created a group related. It was pregnancy or pregnancy related kind of accommodations, where it was the same kind of squishy language we would get. What you could tell was it was mostly fear and concern. And so what we did is we realized that was a relatively small number of people as well. And then going back to Nick's point, we're not trying to start fights where we don't have to. We said, here's a group of employees who've been good employees for us for a period of time. They're concerned about this. What we did was gave them temporary exemptions during the term of their pregnancy, and said, by the time you come back and are back to work, then you need to get vaccinated. So we handled it that way. The biggest struggle for us was the religious exemption. As a hospital, we had mandated the flu vaccine previously. So we would get a handful, maybe 20, 30, people applying for religious exemption for the flu vaccine. That number, 5, 6, 7 times over. All of a sudden, the people got religion when it came to COVID-19. So that was a real struggle for us. And as we were fighting through those, trying to figure out how we were going to manage those, we got lucky. I'll put it like this. We got lucky because, the governor came out with this mandate that excluded the religious exemption. So we didn't have to make the decisions on those. So what I'm hoping for as an employer is when these issues get resolved in the courts, that there's some kind of clear rubric for me. Because as an employer, I'm really going to struggle with trying to understand whether somebody has, some true, firm religious or spiritual belief that they can't take the vaccine. When you look at some of the documents that people submit to you, they start off good. They start off talking about their beliefs and why they can't take the vaccine. And I would say to Nick, advise your clients to stop there. They proceed to go on and make all of these statements that are just not true. They tell me about things that are included in the COVID-19 vaccines that are just not true. They're not factual. They get into things about their life that I don't want to know, and they make me wonder, should they be working anywhere, let alone at a hospital? So, the advice to Nick and his clients is be brief, succinct, and to the point. But honestly, though, as an employer, I'm looking for some guidance. That's the area that we really struggle with. We got a pass because the whole issue in New York State got put on hold, and we're waiting for the result of the court cases. So we basically gave temporary leave to those individuals to continue to work who applied for a religious exemption within our time frame. We had a time they had to do it. And anybody who applied by that time, we just gave them a pass. They have to do the PCR testing and wear a mask. Once we have a decision from the courts, then we're going to go back and kind of educate all those particular requests for exemptions, and we'll see where things go.
Yona, thoughts on this issue of the accommodations as per union involvement?
Well, I think from the point of view of the union, as I said, I think there are situations where you have members who you are going to have to assist. And I do think that basically the same kinds of concerns that Nick has outlined would be the ones that a union would be, documenting the medical issues. I think the religious, as everyone has said, I do think the problem with the religious exemption is that it's essentially very broad in terms of, and you don't want to be like questioning the claims so much, but I think it comes down to, is that a reason, is there going to be undue hardship? So, I think in some of these situations you can figure out a way to make it work, but in others I think there is going to be a problem. And I'm just, as I said, it's a multi-faceted problem, because having people from a health and safety point of view, having unvaccinated people working side by side is raises issues for those who are vaccinated and who want to work in a safe workplace. So, those are the problems that you have to kind of balance. I was also, I can't figure out where else to throw this in, but it kind of goes with they should have stopped when they were talking about their religiously held belief and not go into all the things that are in the vaccine. And I was just going to point out that lest we dismiss everyone who is raising issues about the vaccines and being vaccinated as kooks, the regional attorney from Region 16 of the NLRB has just sued Joseph Biden over the president's executive order on a variety of reasons. I haven't read all the way through it, but I just learned of this last night. And so here you have a regional attorney from one of the NLRB's regional offices who is personally taking up the mantle of challenging the vaccine mandates, so on a personal basis. So, filed in Fort Worth, and Judge O'Connor, who people may remember and recall from a variety of other cases during the Trump administration, is the judge that's assigned to it, and it's seeking an injunction, and it's 4:21 CV 1098. So if anybody's interested, so
Thank you.
variety of people that are taking these positions.
We'll call that breaking news. Now we have breaking news in our book. Now, we do have a few questions, and before I give the code, so no one leave. Johnny, I really wanted to ask you this because this I think is somewhat political, and and I guess the question is, how are you advising clients in, for lack of a better term, red states, with regard to, this whole issue of mandating vaccines? These would be in states where there are low vaccination rates. Has that come up?
It has come up, and it's interesting because I think all of 2020, we spent regretting that we didn't get more training in law school about the police powers and health, safety, and welfare. We just sort of thought like, oh yeah, if there's an emergency, somebody's going to exercise some police powers and solve it, right? And no one thought any more about it until 2020 when we had to think about it all the time. In this year, it seems like we're going to be talking about the supremacy clause, like how do all these individual states that are, threatening to take action. We have, Montana with its position that vaccine mandates are not permitted because vaccine status is a protected class. We either do or don't have Idaho, which is doing the same thing depending on whether the governor or the lieutenant governor is in charge on a given day. We have Florida and Texas, which are trying to make it, really as difficult as possible for employers to have certain kinds of rules about who's vaccinated. And, so I think there's a lot to be worked out somewhere. I'm not sure where and who the parties are going to be about, how are we going to have these federal mandates when we have states saying the opposite? On a real world level, I think part of the OSHA ETS being set up the way it's set up is the recognition that, an employer who only has a 40 or 50% vaccination rate cannot just dismiss 50% of its workforce. And we're having a lot of conversations with employers about how to try to get that number higher, incentive programs that they might consider one way or another, how to get the unions involved in a positive way. I agree with what Reg and Jonas said about partnership. Sometimes unions have been the best, negotiating partner in terms of getting more safety, in terms of being able to persuade members to get vaccinated and explain things to people. People at this point, so much of this comes down to who are people going to listen to, who can persuade them. And my client issuing some policy on corporate letterhead from way up on high may not mean anything at all, but somebody's, fellow union members, their local leaders may be able to influence. My littler colleagues might be surprised to hear this. I still have some hope that there are people who are persuadable and that it doesn't have to be a fight. But it looks very different for our clients sitting in Texas, Tennessee, Florida, other places where the numbers are a lot lower.
Absolutely. On that note, I guess one quick question is, and this is to everyone, and we can try to do this quickly. Have people seen that the mandate or even the possibility of the mandate is forcing more people to get vaccinated? Has that been anyone's experience in terms of they're seeing their clients, et cetera?
I can tell you from the perspective of the hospital, yes, there were people who sent me notes or told me that they submitted their vaccination card, only because they were going to get fired if they didn't do it. So it is having an effect. I hate to see those kind of notes, but again, at the end of the day, we walked away with a 98% vaccination rate, which we were pretty pleased with.
Nick, what about you? People been, more concerned?
I have people that do that, and they say that, they'll come to me and they'll say, what are my rights not to do this? And they'll be required to either show up to work with a vaccination or get fired on Thursday. And I tell them, look, you're at the point now where you got to make a choice, and those people, as far as I know, are typically, when it's not life-threatening, when it's not legitimately life-threatening, they're typically leaning that way. And in terms of getting people vaccinated, I think, you're going to start seeing that slow, gradual move in. Again, once they only have to falter for a day and get vaccinated with J&J, or falter for a moment. They may regret it later, but it's already done, and they're already vaccinated. But I do think it's getting there. And they call me and I just say, at a point, you're going to have to choose, and you can't have it both ways. That's, again, if they don't get the accommodations, if they don't get an exemption. But yes, people don't like being forced with that hard decision, but sometimes it comes, and tell them you're just going to have to eat it or walk away from it.
Yona, any thoughts? Have you any information you have on that? Or
I think I'm saying the same thing, that when it's mandated, the rates are going up in terms of the vaccinations.
Johnny, from your experience, have you seen an increase in people getting vaccinated?
For sure. For the federal contractors, the deadline's December 8th, which means, you got to get cracking if you're going to meet that date. And that 98% number is powerful, right? For whatever reason, these stories are being reported as, 600 employees laid off, but not, 99% got vaccinated. And I think that's what people need to take away from this, that whatever people are saying about labor conditions, labor shortages, et cetera, the vast majority of people, when they're told you do have to get vaccinated, don't actually have a religious objection and don't have a disability or medical contraindication, and most of them are going to do it. But the decision to mandate it is a very big and significant decision for employers. I don't underestimate that at all. But it works. It turns out when you tell people to do stuff, they mostly do.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so here is the code for everyone, and that is this is what you're going to put on your CLE form, which you do need to download before we finish, and that's SS8298. Okay, one more time, SS8298. Now, I'm going to paraphrase a couple of questions that seem interesting, for the group. And one is, do we know whether employers who employ contractors, let's say, if somebody makes a washing machine, for example, and then someone comes out to your house and they use a contractor to actually fix the washing machine, does that vaccination mandate apply to the contractor if they are less than 100 employees? Don't all talk at once.
I don't think there's any easy answers to some of those. We're still trying to figure a lot of those things out. I'll tell you what we tried to do is, our general view was, it can't hurt to ask and it can't hurt to push a little bit. So what we did was, anybody we worked with, people we leased space from, people who provided services, we said when we put our mandate in that it was for employees, contractors who are on site on a regular basis, and anybody who was coming into the hospital regularly, that it would apply. And we reached out to some of the companies we lease space from, asked them about their employees. Again, our theory was, it certainly can't hurt to ask, because it's about creating this environment where the staff feel comfortable. And the more we can say that, hey, we're all vaccinated and the company who cleans the office is vaccinated, people felt better about that. So we figured, why not ask?
Yeah, I think this points to kind of the way that the workforce has changed since Jacobson in 1905, right? You really have to take this broad view of like, who do we have working here and where did they come from? Are they employees? Are they contingent workers? Are we sending somebody else's employees into our customers' homes? You know, I think customers who actually get services at their homes have a fair amount of leeway to say, I'm not letting you into my house if you're not vaccinated, and, you know, not to accept that visit. It's an interesting situation for home care workers right now, as we're seeing in the media. But, you know, contractors, many of them started asking this question back in December, you know, before any of their people were even vaccinated. Can we expect that our customers are going to be requiring them, you know, this? And we said, yes, of course you can expect that. Get ready. You know, so the contractor may not know. Oftentimes the contractor comes from a smaller company and their employment counsel isn't as good. So they may be wrong, but it's rarely the case that the contractor cannot require the vaccine unless they're in Montana.
Right. Yeah. Got it. There's always that Montana exemption.
Montana.
Yeah, here's another question of interest. Let's see if I can just find that for a second. And I know it's hard for us to deal with state law, but someone raised the question of, I think it was Illinois, forgive me if it isn't, but they have sort of like a conscientious type law, you know, like you're allowed to hold to your beliefs. Like, how would that play in Peoria? Get it? You know, that's Illinois too. If someone raised that law and said, I don't want to be vaccinated because of the state law that lets me honor my conscience. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, we don't know yet. This is a law that, you know, primarily was intended to protect, you know, folks who didn't want to participate in offering reproductive health services. It wasn't necessarily meant for this purpose. And certainly the direction that the state of Illinois has taken in terms of its public mandates would be at odds with this. So I know we've got some very skilled Chicago lawyers on the phone or on the webinar with us, and I'm counting on them to work this out.
And they know who they are. So
and they know who they are. One of them emailed me during this. So.
Okay. Any other thoughts from you guys on that?
I guess the thing that I always like to remind people, they don't like to hear it when I say it, is that you may have the right to what goes in or out of your body, but you don't necessarily have the right to work here. And people don't like to hear that, but often that's the fact. And sometimes you have to remind people of those realities, that they're going to have to make a choice. They don't have to ever get vaccinated. But I've told a couple of people, but you know, we don't have an obligation to continue to employ you if we establish this as our rule. Sometimes people have to hear the truth.
Well, and I will chime in on this because I'm now the broken record, now the broken DVD. My suspicion would be that your law of conscience would probably stop when it starts becoming contrary to other people's rights. If your law of conscience says, I don't need to pick up people that, you know, are black or something like that, I think you probably, your right to have that conscience stops when it starts infringing other people's rights. And I think there's probably going to be some decision that your law of conscience in terms of what you get to do is going to stop when it starts being a risk to other people's safety. And I think that's where running into the workplace, you're going to run into the safety issue again, and employers making a decision. You can be as conscientious as you want outside the place, but here you got to work within the four corners of the safety doctrine.
Right. I agree. I think when it comes down to health and safety, that usually is the final, you know, the final roadblock. Well, we are, I think the CLE guys will permit us to end 1 minute early, because I think any other discussion we have will go till 3 o'clock. So, so I just want to thank everyone. I really think we had a very lively discussion. We solved some stuff. We didn't solve stuff. We had, I think, more questions than answers, but it does lend itself to that, this type of subject matter. So thanks to everyone, and I hope everyone got something out of it out there. And on streaming land, and look forward to seeing everybody again soon. So we'll just end it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.